Good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others. On behalf of ULI Canada, welcome to today's program. My name is Renata McGaddis-Blair. I'm a Senior Project Manager at BTY Group. Let's start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. I invite our virtual audience today to share their local land acknowledgements in the chat if they would like to. I'm speaking to you from what is today called Saskatoon. As a person of Filipino and Irish descent, I grew up and now live and work here on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral lands of Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis. I'm early in my journey of learning how this land that has nourished and shaped me has been under the stewardship of Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. I want to learn how to take meaningful steps towards improving nation-to-nation relationships across Canada, to deepen my understanding of the rich diversity of Indigenous peoples and their cultures, and to shoulder my responsibilities as a non-Indigenous Canadian and a member of the industry to take action on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Learning, understanding, and taking responsible action all begin with listening. In this spirit, I invite you to join me in listening to the discussion today, to reflect on how each of us can meaningfully engage with the process of reconciliation, and to learn about how Indigenous-led city building can shape our collective future. So before we start, just a few housekeeping items. First one, everyone will be automatically muted throughout the session to avoid audio interference. Closed captioning is available for this session. You can access it via the button along the bottom of the Zoom platform. If any questions, please use the Q&A function or upvote questions by pressing the thumbs up button. This is a recorded session. The recording will be sent to you after the session. If you'd like to take the conversation online, please tag ULI or our district councils or with the hashtag #AskGreatQuestions. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand the virtual mic over to today's moderator, Tim Coldwell.
Thanks, Renata, and it's an honor to be here today. My name is Tim Coldwell. I'm the president of Chandos Construction. We are a purpose-driven national technical builder that's leading change in the Canadian construction industry. And I'm a member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. I did not grow up in community and have been on a journey of discovery later in my life. In fact, I was taught by my parents to be ashamed of my traditional roots. And over the years, as I've taken more and more leadership in our company, I have been more and more driven by the need for us to practice Indigenous reconciliation. So Chandos is very engaged in this. I personally have a strong connection to it. And I've got some great relationships in the Indigenous world, done some work with some of the panelists that we're going to hear from today. But my big thing is I'm here to learn and I'm here to understand and in some small way practice Indigenous reconciliation. So what we're going to do over the course of the day is we're going to talk about a few projects. There's 6 of them that we're going to speak about. But before we do that, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Dennis Thomas Wahonik.
Osiam Ichwa Mastel Heights after Siam meets up with Quilum Musquim East Homish East Slewata Tamil Wanak Quanisqui Talitsin at Slewata Mastel I Quanisqueluans Quanziquits Nala. In translation, I just wanted to say welcome and really appreciate the opportunity here. I come from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I am from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. My ancestral name is Wanak, and it always gives me great privilege to speak a little bit of my Indigenous language and welcoming people virtually to our traditional territories here on the West Coast. Osiam, Haitsapka. Thank you all.
Bryce Starlight.
Danitara, Bryce Starlight, Size Ata. So my name is Bryce Starlight. I'm from Tsuut'ina Nation, and I work with Tizah Development Corp, a subsidiary of Canderel. I am from Tsuut'ina, which is located just outside of Calgary, and I'd like to thank everyone for listening to us and participating today.
And Brian Porter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Porter of the United Nation. I am the founder and principal of Turo Architect, which is headquartered on Six Nations of the Grand River. We are the most populous Indigenous community in Canada with approximately 27,000 members. Formed in 1992, Jesus, 30 years ago. We offer a full range of architectural services with help from our satellite office in Toronto, which is managed by Mohawk architect Matthew Hickey. Turo works primarily in Ontario, but we have also completed projects in most of the provinces across Canada, as well as beyond the border into New York State and Wisconsin. The focus of our work is to integrate long-held Indigenous values into contemporary buildings, guided by doctrines such as all our relations, planning for the seventh generation, and the seventh grandparent teachings. It's great to be with you all today. Thank you.
Great. Eladia.
Bonjour. Keishikapoik Indishnakas Bashik Kang and Donjaba, Wabashki Maingen and Dodem. So I'm a lady of smoke and I'm principal architect with Smoke Architecture. I'm really pleased to be here in such esteemed company today. And Smoke Architecture is founded in 2014. I've been practicing architecture since 2002, and really pleased to be here on Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee territories in the historic homelands of Huron-Wendat peoples also. So thanks for having me.
Great. And so when we were prepping for this event, Dennis suggested that he would share a traditional song, and we all thought that would be a great way to kick this off. So I'm going to throw it over to Dennis, and he's going to perform a song for us.
Well, Sam, thanks, Tim. First, I'd just really like to thank the Creator for allowing our ancestors' wisdom be transferred to the people that are on this panel today. You know, our people have been through a lot in colonization of 180 something years, and here we are standing together as one, trying to build our Indigenous economy and our Indigenous ecosystems in our core traditional territory. There's still many things to be done that will help us trajectory into thriving and prospering for our communities and our other relatives across Turtle Island. And one of the things that really grounds me and keeps me strong and have good medicine is listen to our traditional songs. And I was very pleased to have my relatives welcome to hearing a West Coast top 10 song of a Coast Salish nation. So this is actually called the Celebration Song. It's the Spirit of Slahau. Oh, hey, oh, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey. Oh, oh, yeah, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, ha, ha, hey, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, ha, 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 hey, hey. Oh, 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 hey, oh, oh, hey. Oh, oh, yeah, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, ha, ha, hey, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, ha, ha, hey, hey. Oh, see ya.
That's great. I just want to bring the slides up if we could. Yeah, so I mentioned at the top that we were going to talk about 6 projects. The four panelists are going to speak to the four projects that they're individually involved with. But I do want to give some recognition to two others. So there's the Odeya Montreal project that is Montreal's newest tower located in the historic waterfront. And the name of the project is Odeya, based on the Cree word Ode, meaning canoe. Next slide, please. And then the second project, so Zibi Condominiums, Dream Impact Trust is the developer of this, along with Dream Asset Management Corp. And this is a great project in Ottawa. The name of the project is Zibi, is the Algonquin Anishinaabe word for river. And Zibi is located at the first meeting place of Canada's three founding nations, the First Nations, the French, and the English. Another great project. So what we're going to do next is each of the panelists has 2 minutes, and we're going to do a bit of a rapid fire session where each panelist has the ability to provide some context on the work that they're doing. And so there's 4 projects that we're going to feature, and Brian Porter is going to go first.
So this is a quick tour of the Indigenous Hub that broke ground on June 21st, 2021 to coincide with National People's Day. Here are some of the parties involved in the development. At the helm is Anishinaabe Health Toronto under the leadership of Joe Hester. Joe worked tirelessly for decades to secure Block 10 from the city to build an Indigenous health center. Once attained, he found a partner in Dream Kilmer to develop the balance of the site through a mutually beneficial 7-generation lease agreement. When completed, the site will accommodate healthcare, employment, training, childcare, heritage features, and residential apartments. It will also host large community events. Next. A dancer's shawl provides inspiration for the exterior of the health center, analogous to the protection and security that a dancer gets from a shawl wrapped around her, excuse me, with hands clenched over her heart. A perforated metal facade wraps the facility. It frames a large portal on the east side that is positioned to greet the rising sun. Next, please. It's important for the ground floor and its entrances to be open and welcoming. We often spoke of the ongoing significance of the nearby Don River. In homage, we introduced elements that are feminine and fluid, and I think they kind of recall pebbles in a stream. Next, please. We appreciate craft. We admire Indigenous constructs like birch bark canoes, baskets, lacrosse sticks, and snowshoes. Contemporary buildings should also celebrate craftsmanship. This illustrates the thoughts that went into creating a connection to the ground, a pedestrian experience with the podium, and a relationship of the towers to the sky. Next, please. This project is unlike other block developments in the city. They create a monolithic plinth to receive towers that are corporate, oftentimes masculine icons in a modernist style. Rather, the Indigenous Hub creates an ecosystem that can be enjoyed by all of our relations. We think about water, fire, rocks, trees, flora, fauna, insects, birds, animals, and people. Next. This slide will be one of the first purpose-built Indigenous facilities in the GTA. It will be a gift to the entire city of Toronto 24/7. And I think throughout all 13 phases of the moon across the calendar year. It will be a living investment, I think, to what can be achieved through earnest truth and reconciliation efforts. Thank you.
That's great, Brian. Bryce Starlight, you can share a bit of on Tizah.
Thanks, Tim. Sorry, next slide, please. So the Tsuut'ina-Canderel partnership was really created to activate lands that are along the reserve's southwest or southeast border. And what the partnership really allows for is Tsuut'ina values to form the bedrock of all decisions. So rather than, so it actually sets out questions to be answered, not just rules to be followed, by using traditional knowledge to solve modern problems. We leverage Tsuut'ina's values to essentially guide our overall development. Next slide, please. The Tizop project is over 3 villages, is 1,200 acres, adjacent to fully established communities on the southwest border of the city of Calgary. Next slide, please. The most northern village is called Tizop Park, which is has mixed-use residential, commercial, office, and tourism and entertainment uses, and also is home to the first 2 auto dealerships on the site. Next slide, please. We're currently looking at a 15-year build-out, and essentially we look to activate all of these lands in the next few years here. Next slide, please. We saw an opportunity with a Tizop crossing to master plan the site with an eye towards a shift in the Calgary market and increasing sustainability focus. Next slide, please. One of the things that we really focused on was how we can create something authentic, purposeful, and new while it's anchored in a clear sense of place, innovating through the lens of traditional knowledge while planning around organizational affinities and building ESG goals that are derived from Tsuut'ina values. The site itself is going to be a multi-residential innovation office and smart farm to define the site. Next slide, please. Tizop Exchange is our southernmost site, and it's consisting of retail, office, and entertainment uses, and is also the home to the first Costco on First Nation reserve land in North America. Next slide. It's currently under construction with development anticipated over the next 15 years. Next slide, please. One of the projects that I wanted to share with you is the Shops at Buffalo Run. Next slide. What we saw with this site is it was a great opportunity for architectural representation of culture. This site itself is 275,000 square feet of retail and office. Next slide. As we looked at the site, though, we want to make it so that we could incorporate culture into the actual built form. So we look for opportunities to incorporate the rolling foothills into the exterior facade, as well as some Indigenous artwork that's appropriate and connected to Tsuut'ina, while at the same time also incorporating larger elements such as the buffalo being represented throughout the canopies here, and the buffalo representing essentially stability and taking care of your people. Next slide. But also bringing in elements such as the eagle, which are really meant to be aspirational and very visionary. Next slide. We also look for ways to enhance the experience by using different materiality treatment within those canopies. Next slide. And also looking for different ways to represent artistic incorporation within the site. And thank you.
That's great, Bryce. Eladia.
Hey, thanks. Just give me 1 second here. So those were really inspiring. Oh my goodness, I'm blown away, Bryce and Brian. Those are just gorgeous. Oh my Lord. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to share a project that was undertaken together with Toronto Public Library and our partnering architects Perkins and Will. And it was such a wonderful collaboration because we got to talk to multiple community members as part of this process, including the illustrious Joe Hester, who worked with you, Brian, because there was some question about we're using a star blanket as our inspiration and you're using a shawl. So there's sort of a parallel gesture happening here. And so we heard from community, it was really important to talk with Aboriginal Hub, director Joe Hester. So we did, and we actually got a super bonus conversation with him because he contributed to our thinking on the design also. So that was really exciting. But this journey of the library inspired us because in Anishinaabe, culture is a verb. It's a thing that you make together in real time by coming together in a space. So we created a format for that included gestures towards several different ideas. So first, the front porch, the idea that along Dawes Road and Chapman here, we have integrated public spaces that are inspired by water and create a place for people to gather informally, even after hours. Then we have activity platforms and a frame that are inspired by the interior gestures of a Haudenosaunee longhouse. So we talked with participants about this, and we heard that Central Bay is inhabited and is under the purview of the clan mother. And interestingly, the roundhouse, which is based on an Anishinaabe architectural typology that sits in the heart of the building very prominently, we heard from participants that needs to be rooted all the way down through the center of the building, which defines that central clan mother bay. So we're really excited by that synergy. And then finally, the whole thing is wrapped together with a blanket, and this symbolizes several things. For one, the Social Development and Finance Association, I think, is coming together with their community hub into this space with TPL, Toronto Public Libraries. So this blanket unites them. Also, that blanket has the connotation of recognizing important community work that benefits the neighborhood as a whole. And that the teachings behind the star blanket are really important. And it symbolizes, that star symbolizes the presence and attention and support, not only of the community, which comes together as a patchwork of multiple unique individuals, but also represents our ancestors, which are recorded in the stars. So we analyzed this patterning and used it to inspire a radial pattern with one focal point on Chapman, visible from that really prominent corner, Chapman at Dawes. And we wrapped the whole thing around with these parallelograms, which form the basis of that geometric design, with punch windows. And a view from the east opens the blanket to the neighborhood, showing that roundhouse very prominently, because we heard from our participants that it was critical to have a safe place for Indigenous knowledge sharing in an urban location. The roundhouse even opens onto a roof garden. So here you see that final element, and the roundhouse opens directly there, and we have a sacred fire available. So this is a ceremony capable space where Indigenous peoples can actually come, follow our protocols, and share our teachings right adjacent to the community hubs, programming space, training area, and community kitchen. So food is always involved. Food and life and lots of community-centric activities on all levels. So this is a view of the interior where you see that Clan Mother Bay, the roundhouse hovering in the space, and just a focus on connectivity throughout. Thank you.
That's great, Eladia. And Dennis, you're going to bring us home.
Is it me, or is the slides not showing up?
It should be there now.
There we go. Perfect. So just wanted to thank Eladia and thank all my other relatives for their presentation. I'm going to touch on a few of the developments that were bought by the 3 local Indigenous nations that traditionally occupied what is now known as Vancouver. So the Musqueam Nation, the Squamish Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And in 2014, after the 2010 Winter Olympic success, we really brought our 3 nations together holistically and harmoniously. And our main objective and mandate was to start buying back our traditional territory in Vancouver for the future generations of our nations. And thus MST Development Corporation was created. So since 2017, we started buying back property. And the 2 largest ones that are still in the early development stages right now are Jericho lands. For some reason, it's not highlighted here, but if you look at the West Point gray, it's that entire pretty much block right above. It's 92 acres. It's one of the largest private held lands in Vancouver, or maybe even Western Canada. And the other one is called Heatherlands, which is right above the word west side. It's another pretty much almost half of a city block. And again, this is prime real estate here in Vancouver. We all know what our real estate prices are over here. And so we're trying to work with the city of Vancouver. One of the things that you can go to the next slide, please. Might give a little bit more of a context here. So this is Ayelmo, and we're bringing back our Indigenous language. City of Vancouver is called, the City of Reconciliation. They are actually working in collaboration with the 3 host nations for these developments, because it helps. It's a 2-prong approach. We're helping build our Indigenous economy and our Indigenous ecosystems, while also providing a dire need of housing affordability in Vancouver. But again, we're changing this. We're indigenizing the development industry as we speak. They've never, in a rezoning development package, we incorporated a cultural interpretive strategy, which has never been done before. And what that sort of breaks down into is that we, as the cultural liaisons for the 3 nations, went to the community, our people, our elders, our aunts and uncles, knowledge holders, with artistic graphic illustrators, and conceptualize what are the 3 nations would like to see in these developments, identify core themes, wind, water, air, fire, how that relates to us as Coast Salish peoples, our legends, our different transfer of knowledge areas, of specifically putting an elders center next to a daycare, so the elders can actually get energy from the kids. That was so important to our people growing up, and we call that the transfer of knowledge segment of that project. In this specific example, the 3 nations really wanted to have iconic towers. As you can tell, the 3 towers represent the 3 nations, and they can see it from every direction of this property. We really wanted to make a big stance of letting the general public and citizens of this area know who the 3 nations were. And within this is obviously our nature and environmental initiatives all come into play with our Coast Salish art embedded in design. We are still in the early phases compared to the other panelists, but you can sort of get the idea. When that does come to fruition, it's going to look beautiful, just like theirs. Next slide. In this concept design, you can, traditionally you would say concept A, concept B, concept C. Well, this is actually called the weave, to represent our Coast Salish weaving style of cedar bark. And you can see the north to southwest to east, the lines in the topography is supposed to symbolize a weave, Coast Salish weave, and how interconnected each of these segments and cultural areas of this design are all interconnected together. When you do weaving, that specific property or that design is stronger together when it's woven. Next slide. You can probably skip this one. It's the same one from before with no lines on it. But we're going to move on to Heatherlands. So Heatherlands is in the rezoning development phase right now. This was the very first one that we really wanted to embed our cultural interpretive strategy. And you can see J1, that's our cultural hub. That's the heart of the development. And this is to represent, and that faces north to the ocean. And what we analyze or envision for this property is that that will be the bow of our canoe facing the ocean. And our cultural customs, when the bow is still facing the ocean, that means it's still ready to go out and paddle. It's still ready. And for us, it was a symbol of that our nation is alive, active, thriving, and want to prosper. As you can tell, within these areas, they're just building numbers with the podiums and the facades. Again, it's all interconnected with our legends and environmental initiatives, and also our cultural ways of being. Our epistemologies are all within this property. And on to my last slide. The next slide, please. Yes. So this is where you get to envision. We have the 3 welcoming poles to welcome everyone that's going to be living in this live, work, play, and learn cultural hub within the core territory of our nations down on Canby Street. As you can tell, we're still in these early stages. But again, everything where you go, every single touch point, every single cultural area has a meaning when you look at the design site maps and layouts. I wish I could show you more. I think that'll be for the next presentation. Osam, thank you.
Great, Dennis. Thank you. And all of those projects are very inspiring. It's awesome to see how the Indigenous values get woven through the architecture and the planning of the projects. It's great. So what we're going to do here next, we're halfway, 30 minutes in, we're doing great on time. We're going to spend about 20 minutes just having a conversation. And the idea here is a bit of a casual chat. We're going to bounce some questions around and just unpack this idea of Indigenous city building. It's easy to say that, but like, what does it actually mean? And I think we want to tackle that a bit here in the next 20 minutes. And as we go through this, make sure that you drop your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to leave the last 10 minutes or so of the event for me to read questions that are put in the Q&A. So I'm going to jump in and let's start with Bryce. And so Bryce, when we talk about Indigenous city building, my mind goes to the infrastructure requirements of large scale developments. What's key to consider when you're doing projects like this?
Geez, so much for the casual conversation. You went right to the tough question, didn't you? So sometimes it's hard to stay away from the negative initially, but that's something that really does have to get addressed. One of the challenges that we've found in the past is that there's a huge resource gap for First Nations communities, especially as it relates to municipal infrastructure. There's just very little access to those programs that other municipalities and towns are able to access. However, we have seen great opportunity for the private sector to work with communities to addressing these shortfalls. And not all of it has to be financial either. There's a lot of non-financial support that can be lent to push government for some of this infrastructure investment and relaxation of rules. We also found that there's very great opportunities for effective and forward-thinking infrastructure solutions, green infrastructure, sustainable and reuse infrastructure. And at the end of the day, trying to find solutions to these challenges really helps to align with the First Nations ethos of conservation for future generations.
Great. So Brian, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people built this country together, and yet there seems to be this hesitance or this resistance to partner. Why do you think that is? And what do you think we need to do to get to a turning point where that hesitance is no longer there?
Two main reasons, I think, Tim. To start, for centuries, Canada has preferred a resource-based economy, excuse me, that continues to exist through the export of natural materials like wood, oil, natural gas, and I think even fresh water. Then they are bought back in value-added products from our international trade partners. And I think this is counterintuitive to Indigenous values. For instance, like when we harvest an animal, we process it locally and every part is used for food, clothing, adornment, and sometimes even architecture. I think we need to become a nation that adds value to the resources that we extract and reaps the benefits of the jobs that come along with it. Second, I think is that business deals between Indigenous and mainstream are impacted by legal challenges. In this category, I would include the inability for Indigenous people to bond, probably aging bona fide land claims. Excuse me, kind of dry in here. And also Canada's unwillingness to honor the treaties that they've signed. I don't think these hurdles will be resolved in my lifetime. But one way forward may be to have less formal consultations between opposing sides. Instead, let's have more business conversations around the table like the one we're having today.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. There's just this immense opportunity for non-Indigenous business leaders to partner with communities and partner with Indigenous-owned businesses. I think that's key from my perspective. Dennis, you talk a lot about building Indigenous ecosystems and this idea of inspiring band members or Indigenous owned businesses to flourish. Can you unpack that concept a little bit more?
Sure. Well, before the settlers and colonization happened, we had robust and complex trade and bartering systems. We had an ecosystem. We had trade, we had commerce up and down this coast. You know, the Ooligan grease, you know, the beaver pelts. Those are actually trails that got converted into main streets here in Vancouver. Kingsway, for example, was built on an Indigenous trail system. So we had these complex business of commerce prior to the new arrivals. And that all got dismantled, obviously, through colonization, the reserve system, and oppression, and residential school. So we had to learn this new way of doing business. And now that there are different members that are went to university and learn how to cope with this new modern society of business, you know, our nation's had a hard time trying to figure out, why do we have to buy back our land? You know, why do we have to do this? But this is just the way that life is now. And as nations, when you join forces with other nations to create a very powerful group in Vancouver and very influential within the municipalities that they live and work, we have a prime opportunity to bring back those ecosystems of helping our members have a healthy job, career, life. Some people aren't meant to work for administration. Some people want to work on their own because they have a special skill. So we need to harness those. We need to support those ecosystems. You know, eventually with all of our developments, our main priority is to hire only Indigenous owned businesses or entrepreneurs, because we're helping that ripple effect again of building back our economy and building back our ecosystem. Imagine saying on a 90-acre development site, 80% was done and completed by our own Indigenous peoples. That is beautiful. That is something that we should all aspire to.
Yeah, no, that's great. Eladia, you know, Indigenous identity is rooted in place, and so how can that be expressed in architecture? You know, I think we saw some great examples of how that could be expressed in architecture early on here. But what's the thought process that you go through as a designer when you work through that kind of a concept?
Well, this gets to sort of a thinking that I've been doing in my own career and imagining a long-term approach to this. So all of us have been working on ad hoc solutions to our project, sort of a project-based Indigenous perspectives approach, where we're embedding perspectives from sort of the consultant and participant group that seems most invested in this particular project. And we sort of try to recruit participants that can speak to that project and give us insights from, you know, a point of view that's important to that territory. And so that's how we've all been kind of working up until now. But the fact is that I think Dennis almost sort of touched on this already. We, in each of our territories, we have already had governance systems that would incorporate Indigenous values into every project just as a default position. And I think that's what we have to get back to. You know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has legislated in Canada that we need to establish free, prior, and informed consent for any development that impacts traditional Indigenous territories, and that is the whole continent. So how do we do that? So we do have precedent already. For example, major municipalities have urban design panels that review works of significance that are occurring in their territories to make sure that their impacts are positive on the overall community. And I think we should start to think about how can we establish that from an Indigenous perspective. For instance, from an Anishinaabe governance perspective, we had the clan system. So the clan system had areas of responsibility allocated to specific individuals and groups. And each of those individuals and groups would come together to advise on any major collective undertaking. In Haudenosaunee cultures, and Brian can speak to this much more eloquently, I'm sure, the clan mothers were part of the governance system that were used. So sitting in a territory that's shared by Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and Huron-Wendat, I would think that some sort of an entity needs to be established so that projects aren't grasping at straws, as it were, deciding on an ad hoc basis. Does this project need to include Indigenous principles? And I think the default answer needs to start to be yes, because Canadians are starting to see that when we do that work, when we liaise and interface with Indigenous, territory protectors in our regions, we have such a rich result. And this is part of our heritage, it's part of our birthright. Canadians deserve to have spaces that are inspired by these Indigenous principles. Because we have to rethink how we deal with, our life systems and the interconnection between life systems. That's becoming abundantly clear. We can't just go on doing things the way we've been doing in this extractive, sort of colonial way that Brian talked about. So how do we find another way? And I think we have to look back, think about our original governance strategies as it pertained to land use, and start doing that on a large scale. So these ad hoc solutions are wonderful, and they can inspire a path forward that's much more collaborative.
So Dennis, I'll go back to you. Why is it important to buy back core traditional lands for future generations?
Well, it's very important, especially for our nation. You know, when you look at provincial and federal crown lands, we have the first right of refusal to purchase them. So when you're an individual nation, it could be a little bit more cost intrusive to do that. So it's better when you have strength in numbers so that our nations can actually buy that. We're not your typical developer, right? A regular developer buys a land, builds it, and sells it, makes maximum profit, right? There's a different, we're a social enterprise. We care about the next 7 generations. We buy it, we build it, we keep it. And we want all of our people, like, some of our community members don't live in the reserves. They live in the city, they live in the suburbs. So if they can actually go downtown Vancouver and be like, hey, I have 6 properties that my nation owns. They feel welcome, they feel safe, they feel like culturalized again. They're like, wow, this is happening in the city. We're in a paradigm shift in society where people are really starting to understand our ways of being, and they want to learn more because it was hidden, right? And that's so important. And when all of these 6 properties that we have, it's over 222 acres of prime real estate in Vancouver. Every single one of them is a cultural dynamic hub that when you get into that property, that land, you're totally going to be like wrapped around with a blanket of just love and reciprocity, generosity, because of how our value system is and still is. So for us, it was, buying back our land really has something to say to our leadership of our each nations, of like, if you think about it, our BC land Indigenous reserves comprise of 0.036%. The rest, 99.37%, is owned privately or by the province. That's just crazy, right? And so here we are. Let's try and break those statistics. Let's try and create new metrics for our future generations. Let's just say how much land we bought back and what we're trying to do for, the people that aren't here yet, and to help society grow with an understanding of our social well-being.
Yeah, no, that's great, Dennis. And, we've got 520 people on this call. Many of them are real estate developers. And I just think that my advice for a real estate developer who wants to partner with Indigenous communities is you got to get your head around, it's not an exploitive, extractive, maximize the lift, flip it sort of an approach. It's a long-term value creation approach. And so I'll just take it over to Bryce next. And, this idea of large scale developments and managing risk, I think that's one of the key things that we see as a contractor across Canada is risk is really important, and how you think about it is super important as well. What's your perspective on that, Bryce?
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. You know, what we're doing at TZA, in a lot of respects, is actually no different than building any subdivision. What we've done with Tsuut'ina is really help to reduce the risk in areas that are within Tsuut'ina's control. So depoliticizing the approvals process, reducing the federal touch points and opinions, and really trying to have those decisions based on facts and rules and regulations so that we can actually ensure consistency in how we're approaching developments. We've also looked at approval risk reduction by ensuring that that depoliticized process is actually formalized. We've also looked at, well, we have reduced the community risk because of the fact that Tsuut'ina is a full partner. It actually, the community sees it as a net benefit because it is seeing those return on investment. And when it comes down to construction, I mean, every construction project is going to have risk associated with it. And I'll say the joke about doing a rain dance to mitigate weather is pretty old. So at the end of the day, it's a normal project. The risks have really been taken down on projects like ours by ensuring consistency and predictability in the product.
Yeah. You know, Bryce, maybe I'll just dig in a little bit more. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there with respect to doing business with Indigenous government or governments, or even, you know, Indigenous owned development companies. What are those common misconceptions, and what do you want this audience to hear? Let's do a little bit of myth busting here.
Well, I'm actually afraid to answer that question because I'm afraid that I'll throw out red herrings versus trying to address them. But you know, I think there's a few of them that typically will come to the surface. You know, one of the main ones is that there is some sort of inefficient or ineffective bureaucracy and process with Indigenous governments. And I would challenge any developer out there to point to a city or municipality that doesn't have an ineffective or inefficient government process and say that that's unique to First Nations. Government is government. All you can really do is try to ensure that you're minimizing those touch points as much as possible, and which is something that we've done at Tsuut'ina. There's a lot of concern about the lack of rules. The nation went through 4 years of developing a full suite of legislation and really use surrounding jurisdictions as their reference points. We also have federal environmental, national building code, Alberta building code as standards. There's also this concern about federal interference or federal unrelenting federal approval process, which in our experience, they've been very open to stepping aside and have actually asked how they can step aside. I think the last one is, well, last one's kind of connected, but there is this concern about business continuity, which we've addressed in all of our legislation, but also the question about the discount on land. At the end of the day, it takes the same amount to service a First Nation reserve as it does to service a city. The costs are the costs, and I think there's no discount because at the end of the day, it's still a marketable piece of land, and you're going to get fair market value for it. So,
great, Brian. I'll shift to you. You know, when we think about cities, how can Indigenous values be expressed in terms of community planning? Can you just talk about that for a minute?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge that every piece of land has a natural carrying capacity. You know, I think we need to think about nature preserves, think about wildlife corridors, think about food sovereignty, think about building on the poorest quality soil and not the best, think about recreation and civic spaces, think about district infrastructure. I mean, people are disillusioned. I think they're feeling alienated by the mainstream planning where success kind of continues to be measured by the size of your house or how many cars you can park in your garage. I believe we're ready for some new models. I think residents will pay a premium Residents will pay a premium to live happier lives that align with Indigenous values, and developers can still maintain their return on investment. I think there's a thirst out there for something that's a little bit different, something that's a little bit more attuned to the environment.
And then Brian, I'm going to ask you one last question before we open it up to the audience here. This is a bit self-serving, so we're a contractor. What's your advice to general contractors who want to partner with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I would say commit to optimizing a holistic approach, that integrates Indigenous people into equity positions, visioning sessions, design, construction, the long-term operations of each development. And this can be done through a variety of mechanisms, like including partnership agreements, set-asides, internships, apprenticeships, mentorships, scholarships, etc. I think you need to make it a guiding principle for your company, and don't wait for a specific project to get started. Start now, and prove that you're sincere, and you can realize the long-term benefits that come with sharing.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll just drop this stat in for people to ruminate on. There's 1.5 million people who work in the Canadian construction industry. The latest forecast has 700,000 of them retiring by the year 2030. That's 46% of the workforce that's going to go poof. And you can imagine what's going to happen to construction costs if that occurs. The Indigenous community is the fastest growing population group in Canada. What an amazing opportunity to provide jobs, training, employment, and not just for carpenters and laborers and plumbers and electricians in the field, for project managers, for superintendents, for estimators, for CEOs and COOs. There's not a role in any construction company that an Indigenous person cannot fill. I'm going to open it up to some questions from the audience here. There's 3 or 4 questions in the Q&A that revolve around what I'm taking as a bit of a conflict between Indigenous values and the planning process and relationships with the adjacent municipalities. Maybe Aladia, can you speak to any challenges or how you overcome any misalignment that may occur with respect to that?
Misalignment,
Maybe the answer is not as big.
urban planning strategies? Like,
Yeah,
I've never run into a situation where incorporating Indigenous values runs contrary to good design and planning principles, actually. In fact, if anything, incorporating regionally appropriate Indigenous land planning principles, I would say really coalesces those principles into a cohesive whole that people can understand and that is more easily communicated to the general public because it relies on narrative. It relies on a kinship relationships as opposed to like highly technical language and sort of like almost like cost benefit analysis. So it brings in a conception of how we view ourselves as humans living in a larger sphere of interconnected life. And that's a lot easier to talk about than net zero carbon or, passive house. So I think it deepens those relationships because it comes from a place of intention. And then all of the technical elements that fall out from that intention are more sincerely felt and pursued as a core value that is absolutely critical to the success of the project.
That's great. We have a question from Bob Ransford for Bryce. Bryce, you mentioned a smart farm. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so we're really looking at how we're actually sourcing food within the development. So one of the concepts that we've looked at, and actually there's a great example in Tawasin called Southland that really elaborates on that. But looking for ways to grow food close to the site so that we're actually reducing our carbon footprint would be kind of the premise of the concept. but also looking to integrate different harvesting methods, or integrating technology, and really working as a kind of a forward-looking approach with universities, with developers, producers, to create this this sense of doing better, to grow your food without having to incur a ton of costs, or produce a ton of carbon by doing it.
Cool. There's a question here from Susan Robertson, and I think this is for Dennis. She's looking for a little bit more information on the actual process that she used with elders and community members with the graphic illustrator. I've always been very interested, like, what does that actually look like? Can you describe that a bit?
Sure. So with Heatherlands, and before we went to the rezoning application, we wanted to create something new. And within our traditions and our culture, before we even make a big nation decision, we have to get input from our members and guidance to get full support. And so what we did is, this was pre-COVID too, it's one of the things that I'll always remember because it was in person, which is great. We actually had our design team, you know, planners, architects, designers, and then we hired graphic illustrators. And once you identify a theme, so ours was the 4 elements, right? The wind, fire, water, land. And we had in our gymnasium, we broke it out into 4 sections with each of those themes. You know, we started with culture, singing, a meal, and then a description of the land project, what our intentions are to do, indigenize, not inspire, but Indigenous-led developments. And we broke our group, our whole members, there's probably like 80 of us, we broke them into 4 sections. We had our workers from our design team in each of those sections, each had a graphic illustrator, and some just listened to what the elders were saying. Some just listened to what the kids were saying. We had a picture of 1,000 words, or 1,000 pictures, like a little thing where it had like environmental, culture, art, different types of mediums, wood, architecture styles. And the kids went up and grabbed their top 10. And then it sort of bundled up that design of what the kids want. And then the elders were just sitting there listening or telling stories of how they grew up and how life was and how important it was to have a transfer of knowledge area, like a gathering location. Right? All of our communities had a gathering location where they just had a stage to share our culture, but also to be inclusive of the different multicultural groups in our area of Vancouver, to be welcome in that. And then our design team took all of that information, was able to create a cultural interpretive strategy.
That's awesome. So I'm getting the 4-minute warning here. And so what I'm going to do, and for each panelist, like literally 20 seconds, 10 seconds kind of a thing. We've got almost 500 people from the development industry on the line. There's a lot of real estate developers here, a lot of city planners. What's the one thing that you want that audience to take away from what we've talked about today? I'll start with you, Bryce.
Besides Lisa Tizah,
call Bryce, sign a deal, get on with it.
Absolutely, we're open for business. No, it's that partnerships with Tsuut'ina or with First Nations communities are easy to do. There's a little bit of work that needs to go into it, but at the end of the day, they are so beneficial for the community, not from a hand up, but from a hand up, not a handout process. So it's very forward looking and very beneficial. So,
great. Eladia?
Talk to Indigenous peoples. So I think part of the challenge of our nation has been that Indigenous viewpoints have been intentionally sublimated to the detriment of all Canadians. So to get back from that place, we need to, for any project we undertake, see what your local First Nation has on the go. See if there are any synergies. Reach out to them and ask them if they'd like to be involved in your project. And if so, to what extent? And listen to what they say. Enact what you hear.
Great. Brian?
At the risk of dating myself, there was a Cracker Jack commercial that used to be on TV a few decades ago, and it had Jack Gifford was the character actor, right? And he asks the kid, what did excuse me, he said, what did you learn at school today? And the kid said, sharing. So that would be my message.
That's great. And Dennis.
My one comment would be to actually have those very intimate conversations of first decolonizing their structure. Unfortunately, people need to understand what really happened to our communities. And without that understanding, a relationship really doesn't formulate, right? Because it's still too Western. And they need to actually get in the canoe, paddle in the waters that our ancestors did, hear our stories, be a part of the community to actually really build a true partnership. Sometimes they take many years. And to understand those ways and philosophies and ideologies of being, and really to making the social impact and what I call the quadruple bottom line, right? People, profit, purpose and place. So understanding those philosophies and trying to help really foster building our communities. You know, that's the number one thing, because we don't want them just to help us build something and leave. It's a relationship.
That's great. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today. It's been an honor to share the stage with you. You know, my own journey, I mentioned at the top that I didn't grow up in community. I'm a member of the Mohawks, the Bay of Quinte. And for me, it's all about learning and just spending time with Indigenous people and coming to those relationships authentically with a long-term view, with a desire for real partnership. I just really think that that's key. So thank you all for being here. And on behalf of ULI Canada, I want to thank you all. I'd also say we've got some upcoming events, so please make sure that we check out the upcoming programs for ULI British Columbia, Alberta, and Toronto. We have some very exciting events lined up. You can register for any of them by following the link in the chat. And we look forward to having you on a future webinar. Thanks so much for joining. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.